All right, I only finished this last night, so I'm not sure I necessarily have this fully chewed on as per usual. But I just finished season 2 of True Detective last night. This is something that had no real interest in seeing for a while, kind of seeing the critical reception of it when it came out. But that's always kind of a mistake. There's some things like Doom: The Dark Ages. Sometimes you can read if you read some critical reception to something before you watch it or experience it, you're going to be kind of spoiled on it because you should kind of go into things fresh. But it kind of occurred to me that, yeah, it's not going to be, everyone's get out of the way, it's not going to be True Detective Season 1, which is, like, I don't know, to me, far and away, like, the greatest season of television ever made. Just by its structure, and its weirdness, and its cohesion, and, just, like, the epic form of it. But it's still a really good show. Like, if this had been the first season that came out of True Detective, people were like, whoa, this is nothing like this on television. It is grim. It is heavy. There's a concept in arts and entertainment of, like, the sophomore curse. Like, the hardest album to make is your second album, in some ways, or your second book, or your second movie. Because all you have to jump off from is just one thing. And let's say you made a first thing, which is very, like a what's Kanye's first album called? College Dropout, or let's say, or I don't know, Reservoir Dogs, whatever. You can only sort of your only point of reference is one thing, so you either stay too close to it or you jump off too far from it. So, season 2 of True Detective is more of like an ensemble piece to some degree. There's like it's very complicated, with probably like 4 or 5 essentially intertwining stories and central characters, and as someone who reads a lot of detective books and knows that like 30s to 50s private investigator California genre pretty well, it's pretty clear early on from this that there is a lot of that like private dick cop trying to sort out a mystery involving a lot of rich people, which is so common in California fiction. But there's also a lot of Chinatown in that. Chinatown was like a full 10 or 20 years after sort of like the apex of Humphrey Bogart style private eye movies. And what was so interesting about it is the way that it makes as the central crime some of like the water deals that made LA what it was, which are like crime of the century style scope to it. So you can really see that in True Detective Season 2, where some of the plots are like strange sex crimes and like I don't know, like rich dalliances, but essentially it's about like, especially around the Vince Vaughn plot, essentially seems to be like land parcels and corruption, poisoning the air, poisoning the water, and poisoning the land to basically make a railway system. Because that is like legitimately big money. That's not stealing a Maltese Falcon or like robbing a bank. Like that is like billions of dollars essentially. Um, I found the first couple episodes, I think there's 8 total. For me, there seems to be a lot of people and a lot of characters and a lot of minor characters and like suspects and all these things being thrown out at once. I found it's a little bit dizzying, and that is one of the ways that like the first season has an advantage over it in that there's basically a little more of like a linear investigation narrated by and talked through by 2 characters who are so central to the plot that you kind of follow the twists and turns more. This is a little more, a ton of different stuff that resolves in, but I don't necessarily know if it resolves in as satisfying a way because some things like the 2 children and some other plot lines, you're just, they do fit together, but it's not like you have a wow moment to them. So, it is really dark, and there's a couple of strange things performance-wise that kind of sticks with me. I do think this was like legitimately enjoyable, and I really wanted to see where it went. I think that one way that I can't help but compare this in many ways to season 1, which is really boring, I know, in some ways, but it is the inevitable comparison. I think there's 3 central ways that this suffers compared to the first season. I don't know if I want to do it this way. You can really notice the way that the fact that there's multiple directors compared to just one with Cary Fukunaga making the first season, you really don't see the same sort of visual coherence there's not really like an aesthetic to this one outside of it being often drab and sort of dark. Vince Vaughn's character, I often wonder about. I really genuinely like the way that him and his gangster's mole have like a beautiful sort of romantic love story in a lot of ways. I find the way that he's speaking and his overall severity sometimes feels a little odd, especially the way that he's speaking, particularly in earlier episodes. And throughout the entire thing, it seems a little forced. They're trying to do maybe like a sort of Edward G. Robinson or type of dialogue, but it seems a little bit awkward on his mouth. Although I do really like the way that his story then blends into the other. And I do really like the way that it ends for him, despite the way that his dad speaks to him as he walks through the desert in a way that is sort of a caricature of an abusive dad. I would like to have seen that be more nuanced. Rachel McAdams is like a famously beautiful person. So is Colin Farrell. It's very funny to see their characters be two people who are so fucked up and so like beaten down by life and weary and smoking, stuck in like horrible hotel rooms and like terrible circumstances and being so down, but yet still it's Colin Farrell and Rachel McAdams, like two of the most beautiful people on the planet. I actually, without really liking a lot of other things I've seen him in, he's really good when he's like loose in movies like In Bruges, stuff like that. I actually think Colin Farrell, the most of anyone, understands the tone of this show the best, and is probably the best performance in it. Rachel McAdams is almost a little bit, in terms of her character to some degree, but also sort of her performance is, I would argue, two-dimensional. She's only tense and sort of dark and sad, and she's an important character to it, but I think she's sort of like misused or maybe miscast in this to some degree. There's not really like a sharpness. There's only sort of like a depression to some degree. I really think Colin Farrell is like perfect in this. I think it's like one of the best things I've seen him do. He like gets the tone of it perfectly. He either picked up on it, or or he was sort of like directed in such a way that he absolutely is the heart of the show in many ways. He's the perfect sort of emotional center to it. I think that it is also somewhat the way the Rachel McAdams character is also sort of links to the overall tone and structure of the show in a way where I saw a couple of things early on, like when they check through Casper's house in the first episode. It seems to me, I might have hallucinated this, but there seems to be an actual tiny naked female bathing and immersed in a bowl of what looks like milk. And then also when Colin Farrell is attacked in Casper's second house by a tall, lanky person with a crow mask, I'm like, okay, this is going to be very weird, hallucinatory, and strange in the same sort of psychedelic way the first season was. I would not say that was necessarily followed up with in later episodes, which continues to be more of a complicated procedural, without that same sort of level of strangeness. It has still very exciting action shots, especially at a cabin in the woods near the end. And there's a couple other things about like the moral quality of the characters, like especially the leads, like Colin Farrell and Vince Vaughn and Rachel McAdams as well. They all like are like struggling people who do sort of have themselves redeemed at some level or another by their constancy ethically. Particularly Colin Farrell when it comes to his son. He's like another kind of classic example of a man who has a good heart, but like the worst possible coping mechanisms in the world. And I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people who are like that. I think maybe a lot of men are like that to some degree. So I think it's basically that we don't know how to handle like the strong feeling that we get without like a self-destructive urge. And I have to mention that often causes other people to suffer for it. so I don't want to romanticize it too much, but I do think it's true. Overall, this was, in a vacuum, a terrific show that would have caused quite a sensation, but the fact... I don't really have much to say about Woodrow's character. There's a strange moral quality where him hiding his gayness is what gets him punished. He does have, like, another character with a very, very strong moral code. You could say that's the central theme of, like, the 4 principal characters is a very strong moral code, despite challenging circumstances. But I don't really understand his purpose in a lot of ways. All these women are left holding the bag and also the baby in this circumstance, which is pretty funny. And just generally speaking, I can understand the way that after like the absolute inspired mastery of the first season, with narration from the present, pulling back to the past, and then an ending moving forward in the present, the time skip, and just like the depth of the characters in the first one, the sort of gradual switching between the two principles from who's the steady one and who isn't, the love triangle, all of these things are impossible to match. There's really interesting things here about the hotel near the end, where Rachel McAdams and Colin Farrell just sort of seem to get together without much impetus. They've been sharing cigarettes for a while. There is an intimacy there, but for them to get as deep into it as they do, after this, sort of seems to be just like a matter of course and a matter of fate. They're bored in a hotel room. Things move forward for them. And I think there's something in there about how there's just like a natural gravitation toward each other, especially in moments of vulnerability, that, I don't know, you don't always see elucidated so well in a show. Overall, I was very intrigued by how this is going to go. I did really enjoy it. I can't help but compare it to the previous ones. I do think on its own it is quite good. I think Colin Farrell is like the strongest part of it. Vince Vaughn's arc is very interesting. I think like his character was a little bit under-established. I don't think that's necessarily his fault. I do like him in this kind of role. He is a heavy in a lot of ways. There's too many proper nouns. There's too many characters introduced in the flurry in the beginning for me personally to follow adequately. I think Rachel McAdams is sort of miscast or too two-dimensional in it, and I do really, really genuinely like her quite a bit. Toronto represent. And overall, there's some really, really special moments in here, like that girl singing in the bar, and a lot of like the little mistakes they make along the way. Vince Vaughn forgetting about the Mexicans near the end. Colin Farrell, Velcoro, having like that moment where he has to go back to his kid. He can't just run away. There's a big thing in all these California private investigator movies is that you either get away with your life or you make a run for it with the money, but you never get both. You never get the Maltese Falcon. You never get the payday if you're what's the guy's name? It's not Stan Spade. What's the Raymond Philip? If you're Philip Marlowe, you never get the money. It always goes somewhere. You either get the money or you get your ethics. And this is very, very true. There is 35 out of the 125 minutes left at the end of the final episode after they get like the $10 million payday or $12 million payday. And there's just this incredible sense of dread about how it's going to go wrong. And it goes wrong because there's ends that weren't tied up. And so overall, I do genuinely really like the way that the creator acknowledged what the bones are of the California crime detective story in a way that's a little bit better than just kind of pandering to the Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett type stories. He did a very, very good job of that. I do think the show is slightly too grim. I feel like it could have used some levity, but maybe that would have lost out to some degree tonally. And overall, I'm glad I watched it, and I do think I will watch the third one. It is kind of interesting how the first one is so good and so like mystical that I never really wanted to watch the second one in order to not be inevitably disappointed. But on its own, it's fucking sick.